There's a moment that almost everyone has experienced, but very few people ever talk about. You open your laptop because there's one email you need to answer. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. You look at it. You know exactly what you need to write. And yet, you don't. Maybe it's the laundry sitting in the corner of the room. Maybe it's the message you've been meaning to reply to for 3 days. Maybe it's a simple phone call you've postponed all week. None of these tasks are difficult. None of them require extraordinary effort. But for some reason your brain treats them as if they're climbing a mountain. Eventually, you start asking yourself the same painful question. What's wrong with me? Maybe I'm just lazy. Maybe I have no discipline. Maybe everyone else has figured out how to be an adult, except me. But what if none of those things are true? What if the problem isn't that you're unwilling to do the work? What if your brain has simply been carrying more than it was ever designed to carry? Because here's something most people never realize. A brain can become overloaded long before a person looks overwhelmed. And today we're going to explore what actually happens inside your mind when even the smallest tasks begin to feel impossibly heavy. If you're interested in understanding the hidden psychology behind everyday struggles like this, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we explore the science of human behavior in a simple, practical way that helps you better understand yourself and the people around you. Let's begin. Imagine waking up before your alarm. Not because you're energized. Not because you're excited. But because your mind quietly started working before your eyes even opened. Before your feet touched the floor, it's already reviewing yesterday's conversation. Remembering the bill that's due next week. Wondering if you said the wrong thing in yesterday's meeting. Thinking about the appointment you still need to schedule. Planning dinner. Remembering your parents. Your children. Your deadlines. Your future. You haven't done a single physical task. Yet your brain has already spent energy. Most people assume exhaustion comes from doing too much. But often, it comes from thinking too much without ever getting the chance to finish thinking. Psychologists sometimes describe this as cognitive load. Think of your working memory as a desk. When it's clean, adding one more document isn't a problem. But imagine that same desk after months of never putting anything away. Every unfinished responsibility. Every unanswered question. Every promise you made yourself. Every decision you postponed. They're all still sitting there. Now someone places one tiny piece of paper on top. Objectively, it's almost nothing. Subjectively, it feels like too much. That's why simple tasks suddenly feel impossible. The task itself isn't heavy. It's landing on top of everything else. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about mental overload. People see someone avoiding a 5-minute task and assume the task is the problem. It rarely is. The task is simply the final drop landing in an already full bucket. And because nobody can actually see what your mind has been carrying, they only notice the part where nothing gets done. They never see the invisible work happening underneath. Think about how many thoughts quietly compete for your attention every single day. The conversation you wish had gone differently. The money you're trying not to worry about. The news headline you can't stop thinking about. The package that still hasn't arrived. The appointment you forgot to make. The relationship that feels uncertain. The habit you promised yourself you'd finally change this month. Individually, none of these thoughts seem overwhelming. Together, they create something your brain was never designed to manage continuously. Your mind doesn't separate life into neat little categories. Everything competes for the same limited mental resources. That's why someone can look perfectly calm on the outside while feeling completely overwhelmed on the inside. And here's the surprising part. Your brain doesn't only spend energy solving problems. It also spends energy remembering that the problems still exist. Even when you're watching television. Even when you're scrolling through your phone. Even while you're trying to relax. Part of your mind quietly keeps whispering, "Don't forget about tomorrow. Don't forget that email. Don't forget that conversation. Don't forget you still haven't figured everything out." Those whispers rarely become loud enough for you to consciously notice them. But they're loud enough for your brain. And over time they become expensive. One of the most fascinating discoveries in cognitive psychology is that unfinished tasks have a remarkable tendency to keep pulling our attention back toward them. Not because they're urgent, but because the brain dislikes incomplete patterns. It wants closure. It wants resolution. It wants certainty. The problem is that modern life creates far more open loops than our minds can comfortably close. And that's where things start becoming even more interesting. One of the most famous findings in cognitive psychology is called the Zeigarnik effect. Researchers discovered that unfinished tasks occupy more mental space than completed ones. Your brain keeps tagging them as still active, even when you're not consciously thinking about them. Imagine trying to enjoy dinner with your family. Outwardly, you're there. You're listening. You're smiling. You're answering questions. But somewhere in the background, your brain quietly reminds you about the project that's due next week. The doctor's appointment you still need to schedule. The message you forgot to answer yesterday. It's like listening to music while someone leaves a faucet dripping in another room. At first, you barely notice it. After hours, you can't stop hearing it. This is why mental overload is so deceptive. It isn't always loud. Most of the time, it's incredibly quiet. Quiet enough that you mistake it for your personality. You begin saying things like, "I've always been bad at focusing. I'm just not disciplined. I guess I'm naturally disorganized." When, in reality, your brain may simply be trying to manage hundreds of tiny unfinished demands at the same time. And here's where another misunderstanding begins. Most people think motivation comes first, then action follows. But neuroscience often shows the opposite. Action creates clarity. Clarity creates momentum. Momentum creates motivation. The overloaded brain reverses that process. It waits to feel mentally clear before beginning. The problem is that clarity never arrives. Because every hour spent waiting creates another unfinished task, another open loop, another mental reminder, another invisible weight. It's like standing in front of a messy room, believing you'll clean it once you feel less overwhelmed. But every day you wait, the room becomes just a little messier. Eventually, you don't even know where to start. That's exactly what happens inside an overloaded mind. People often describe this experience as procrastination. But procrastination is frequently misunderstood. It isn't always about avoiding work. Sometimes it's your brain protecting what little cognitive energy it has left. Think about what happens when your phone battery drops to 1%. Suddenly, it begins shutting down background functions. The screen gets darker. Certain apps stop updating. Performance slows down, not because the phone is broken but because it's trying to survive long enough to keep its most important systems running. Your brain does something remarkably similar. When mental resources become limited, it starts conserving energy. Not consciously. Automatically. Tasks that require planning, decision-making, problem-solving, starting something unfamiliar, they suddenly feel much more expensive than they actually are. Meanwhile, activities that require almost no executive effort become incredibly attractive. Scrolling, watching another short video, refreshing social media, rewatching a familiar series. Not because they're deeply satisfying, but because they ask almost nothing from your already exhausted brain. This surprises many people. They assume they're choosing distraction because they're lazy. In reality, they're often choosing the option with the lowest cognitive cost. Your brain isn't asking, "What is the most productive thing I could do?" It's quietly asking, "What requires the least energy right now?" That question changes everything. Because suddenly, behaviors that once looked like personal failure begin making psychological sense. Even deciding what to eat can feel exhausting. Choosing what to wear. Picking which task deserves your attention first. Replying to one text when 5 others are still waiting. Each decision seems insignificant by itself. But decision after decision slowly drains the same limited pool of mental resources. Researchers refer to this as decision fatigue. The more choices your brain has already processed today, the harder it becomes to process the next one. That's why some of the world's busiest people intentionally reduce small daily decisions. Not because choosing clothes is difficult, but because preserving mental bandwidth matters. Your brain doesn't distinguish between small decisions and important ones as much as we think. Every choice costs something. When enough of those costs accumulate, even beginning feels exhausting. And perhaps the hardest part is this. From the outside, nobody notices. People see someone sitting on the couch. They don't see the hundreds of invisible calculations happening inside that person's mind. They don't see the unfinished conversations replaying, the financial worries looping, the constant self-monitoring, the quiet pressure to keep functioning no matter how tired they feel. So they assume the person simply isn't trying hard enough. Eventually, you start believing that too. The moment you begin believing you're lazy, something dangerous happens. You stop questioning the story. Instead of asking, "What is my brain struggling with?" you begin asking, "What's wrong with me?" Those are two completely different questions. One leads to understanding. The other leads to shame. And shame is one of the heaviest mental burdens a person can carry. Because shame doesn't simply hurt your emotions. It changes the way your brain allocates attention. Instead of using energy to solve problems, you start using that same energy to judge yourself. You replay yesterday's mistakes. You compare yourself to people who seem to have everything together. You criticize yourself for being tired, Then you criticize yourself for criticizing yourself. Without realizing it, you've created another mental task your brain now has to carry. Many people don't notice this because self-criticism feels productive. It feels like you're holding yourself accountable. But psychologically, something very different is happening. Imagine asking someone to carry a backpack filled with bricks. Now imagine yelling at them because they're walking too slowly. Your criticism doesn't remove a single brick. It only makes carrying them harder. The same thing happens inside your mind. Every time you tell yourself, I should be stronger. I should have figured this out. Everyone else can handle this. You're adding emotional weight to an already overloaded system. Ironically, the brain interprets chronic self-criticism as another problem that needs constant monitoring. Another open loop. Another source of stress. Another reason to conserve energy. This is why people often feel trapped in a cycle they can't explain. The more overwhelmed they become, the more they judge themselves. The more they judge themselves, the more mentally exhausted they become. And the cycle quietly repeats. Maybe you've noticed something similar in your own life. You don't celebrate finishing a task. You immediately think about the next 5. You don't enjoy a free afternoon. You spend it feeling guilty for everything you haven't done yet. You finally sit down to relax, only to feel anxious because relaxing somehow feels irresponsible. Over time, your brain begins associating rest with guilt instead of recovery. That may be one of the clearest signs that mental overload has been building for much longer than you realized. Around this point, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever mistaken mental overload for laziness? Or have you caught yourself feeling guilty for resting, even when you knew you needed it? Share your experience in the comments. Reading your stories helps build a community where people realize they're not the only ones feeling this way. And if you're finding this video helpful so far, consider leaving a like. It really helps this video reach someone who may need to hear it today. Now here's the part most people never expect. Recovery isn't simply the absence of work. Recovery is the absence of unnecessary mental demand. Those aren't the same thing. You can spend an entire evening doing nothing and still wake up mentally exhausted. What? Because your body stopped working. Your brain didn't. Think about how many people end their day by scrolling through hundreds of short videos. On the surface it feels like rest, but your brain is still making thousands of tiny predictions. New faces, new sounds, new information, new emotional reactions, new comparisons, new decisions about whether to keep watching or move on. That's not true recovery. It's continuous stimulation. Your mind never gets permission to settle. Real psychological recovery often looks surprisingly ordinary. Closing unnecessary tabs. Finishing one tiny unfinished task instead of thinking about 20. Allowing silence without immediately reaching for your phone. Doing one thing instead of 5 at once. At first, this feels uncomfortable. Almost too quiet. Because an overloaded brain becomes so accustomed to constant stimulation that stillness can feel unfamiliar. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. In fact, for many people, that quiet discomfort is the first sign that their nervous system is finally beginning to slow down. The goal isn't to empty your mind. That's impossible. The goal is to stop asking your mind to carry everything at once. Imagine trying to hold 10 grocery bags in one trip. Could you do it? Maybe. But eventually something slips. Not because you're weak. Because your hands have limits. Your brain has limits too. We've become so accustomed to carrying invisible responsibilities that we've started believing those limits shouldn't exist. We admire people who are always available, always productive, always connected, always responding, always achieving. But very few people ever ask what all of that constant mental availability costs. Every notification asks for your attention. Every decision asks for a little energy. Every unfinished responsibility quietly waits in the background. Eventually, your brain adapts the only way it knows how. It slows you down. Not to punish you, to protect you. That changes the way we should think about productivity. Maybe becoming more productive isn't the first goal. Maybe reducing unnecessary cognitive load is. Because when your brain finally has room to breathe, something interesting happens. Focus doesn't need to be forced. It begins to return naturally. Motivation doesn't have to be manufactured. It starts appearing on its own. The same mind that felt incapable of sending one email suddenly finds enough clarity to finish 3 meaningful tasks. Not because it became smarter overnight. Not because it finally became disciplined. Because it finally had enough available resources to function the way it was designed to. Think about the moments when you felt surprisingly productive. Chances are your life wasn't completely stress-free. But your mind probably wasn't trying to juggle 50 different unfinished concerns at the same time. Clarity rarely comes from pushing harder. More often it comes from carrying less. That's an important distinction. We've been taught to treat ourselves like machines that simply need better habits. But the human brain isn't a machine. It's a living system constantly trying to balance attention, memory, emotion, uncertainty, and energy. When one of those systems becomes overloaded, the others compensate. That's why forcing yourself through exhaustion often creates even more exhaustion. Sometimes the most psychologically intelligent decision isn't adding another productivity technique. It's removing one unnecessary demand, finishing one small open loop, saying no to one commitment, turning off one source of constant interruption, allowing one moment of genuine stillness. Small changes like these may seem insignificant, but your brain doesn't recover all at once. It recovers one reduced demand at a time. If you've spent months, or even years, feeling like you're constantly behind, constantly tired, constantly wondering why everyday life feels harder than it should, consider this possibility. You were never fighting laziness. You were fighting overload. And those are not the same battle. A computer doesn't become slow because it's defective. It becomes slow because too many programs are running in the background at the same time. Close a few of them and suddenly everything responds faster. Your brain works in much the same way. It doesn't always need more motivation. It often needs fewer open tabs. So the next time you catch yourself saying, "I'm just lazy," pause for a moment. Ask yourself a different question. What has my brain been carrying that nobody else can see? You may discover that the answer changes the way you see yourself. If this video resonated with you, let me know in the comments what invisible mental load you've been carrying lately. And if you found these insights helpful, don't forget to leave a like. It helps this video reach others who may be silently struggling with the same experience. Thank you for spending these moments with me. And if you'd like to continue learning how your mind works, and how small psychological shifts can create meaningful changes in everyday life, click on the video that's appearing on your screen now. I think it's the perfect next step after this one. I'll see you there.